Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Bartley Luce Director, and this is Munich Dialogues on Democracy. Together with our partners at Amerikahaus, which is the Bavarian Center for Transatlantic Relations, as well as the Yale Club of Germany, I'd like to welcome you all to our evening about what is going on in India. We're online tonight, but don't worry, our next event will be in-person hybrid again. For this topic and panel, online was just our very best option. So thank you for joining us. While at first glance, it doesn't seem transatlantic, our partners at Amerikahaus have enthusiastically supported this event tonight because what happens in the world's largest democracy affects all of us here in Europe, in America, and it has ramifications indeed on the transatlantic relationship. So this event tonight was born a few months ago when one of our members contacted me to ask if we would consider turning our attention to the state of democracy in India. She introduced me to one of the amazing panelists joining us tonight, and with his support, we invited the other two rock stars to round out the expertise. I am truly humbled by the award-winning work that all three guests bring to us tonight. I'm going to keep my remarks short to allow as much time as possible with them. Our structure tonight will be my introduction of all three panelists, and then they will take over directly and each speak for 10 to 15 minutes. And then I'll be back with them for some question and answer time. You can ask questions live on the YouTube chat column, or you can send an email, as always, to event@amerikahaus.de. And that's the German spelling AMERIKAHAUS.de. The fantastic team over at Amerikahaus will be monitoring both and feed us the questions. And the last thing I want to say is the link on YouTube will remain up if you would like to share this evening with someone who can't be with us live now. India is often called the world's largest democracy, but the US-based nonprofit Freedom House downgraded India from free to only partly free in March, citing a decline in civil liberties since Modi came to power in 2014, including the intimidation of journalists and activists. Reporters Without Borders notes that India is one of the world's most dangerous countries for journalists trying to do their job properly, and the group's annual World Press Freedom Index ranks India at 142 out of 180 countries. To put everything in context for us, I am thrilled that our first speaker will be Yale professor Stephen Wilkinson. Professor Wilkinson is the Henry R. Luce Director of the MacMillan Center and the Nilekani Professor of India and South Asian Studies and Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Yale. He's also currently the Dean of Yale's Faculty of Arts and Sciences, just in case you get bored, right? He has worked on political conflict in India, and his first book on that topic, Votes and Violence, won the American Political Science Association's award for Best Book on Politics, Government, and International Affairs. He's also interested in corruption in politics, and he co-edited the book Patrons, Clients or Politics, Patterns of Political Accountability and Competition. And he's currently working with Saumitra Jha on a book on war and political change. I can't think of anyone better to open the evening for us tonight. Professor Wilkinson will then hand the baton over to our second speaker, who is Siddharth Varadarajan. Siddharth is the founder and editor-in-chief of the nonprofit news site, The Wire, which is a leader in India's digital news media revolution. The recipient of the 2021 Free Media Pioneer Award from the International Press Institute, to name just the latest award they won, they are hailed as an unflinching defender of independent, high-quality journalism. I'd like to paraphrase their accolades. Published in English, Hindi, Urdu, and Marathi, The Wire has emerged as a prominent voice in India's otherwise crowded media landscape, combining fearless watchdog reporting with sensitive coverage of how the authorities' policies and actions impact the day-to-day lives of Indians. Its YouTube channel, with 3.5 million subscribers and 24 million views a month, has one of the largest reaches of any newspaper or digital news site video platform. Amid India's press freedom downslide, The Wire's commitment to public interest news has also made it a growing target of government harassment. And the pressure on The Wire and its journalists took an even darker turn this summer with the Pegasus Project revelations. The phones of, amongst others, our guest were shown to have been infected with Israeli-made spyware, presumably at the behest of the Indian government. Siddharth was also a 2009 Poynter Fellow at Yale, so a special Yale Club welcome tonight as well. And after Siddharth gives us a view of what it feels like on the street in India right now, our third guest will open the perspective to how this all affects India's foreign policy and therefore us. Professor Manjari Chatterjee Miller is a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she's currently researching and writing on US-India relations, India's foreign policy, and political, economic, social, and cultural developments in India and South Asia. She's a tenured associate professor at the School of Global Studies at Boston University, and she's also a research associate in the Contemporary South Asian Studies program at Oxford University. She's a monthly columnist for the Hindustan Times and the author of Why Nations Rise, Narratives and the Path to Great Power, which is a fantastic book. I really enjoyed this book. She shows how we can look to history to learn fascinating patterns of behavior in countries that have increased their economic and military power and had the opportunities to rise up and become great powers and did or did not, and use these patterns to understand China and India today. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for making the time to be with us tonight, and turn the screen over to Professor Wilkinson in New Haven. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Bartley. Just to make one small correction, I am not the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at the moment. That is my boss, Dean Tamara Gendler. So I'm lucky I don't have even more jobs. But anyway, thank you so much for having me here. So I thought it might be useful before we talk to Siddharth, who is on the ground, for me to give a bit of a historical introduction to India's enormous democratic achievement since independence. Because India was born in an environment that many people thought was not propitious for democracy. It was born amidst the horrible violence of the partition in 1947, the forced migration of 14 million people between countries, the murder of hundreds of thousands of people, and a system that had been structured by the British deliberately along religious lines for several decades. In addition to other bad inheritances at the point of independence, and high levels of inequality and a very strong majoritarian Hindu nationalist movement. And lots of observers doubted whether democracy could be sustained in that kind of environment. And it was. And this achievement, India's achievement over many decades after independence, is all the more striking given the extended periods of military and authoritarian rule in Pakistan and Bangladesh within its immediate neighborhood, as well as the fact that many former colonies across the world had much more difficult experiences with the transition to independence and democracy than India. So why did India succeed so well? I think there are a number of reasons. One of them is that India had a broad-based party at independence with millions of members, the Indian National Congress, which had existed since the 1880s. And at the point of independence, that party had broad legitimacy in the country. It was internally democratic, and it also had a very strong group of leaders at the top. And having a large number of leaders was important because the Muslim League in Pakistan was really a Jinnah operation with just a handful of leaders underneath it. And if you perform the counterfactual experiment and you say, if Nehru had died, would the party have been able to chug along? I think the answer in India is yes. And as we saw in Pakistan, once Jinnah died, the party had real problems. So the fact it was a broad-based party was very important. The Congress also had a lot of experience in government and administration, and it had been thinking for a long time about the kind of democratic state it wanted to build. And after independence, it quickly took a number of key decisions that shaped India's democracy. The 1950 Constitution banned religious and caste discrimination. It established the state's secular character. It guaranteed things like a mass franchise, freedom of speech. It created institutions like the Supreme Court. It established an election commission to supervise fair elections, and established also protections for civil servants against undue political interference in what they were doing. The party was also adaptable when it was pressured by societal groups that wanted change. So Nehru, after the partition, didn't originally want to create lots of new states to deal with regional demands, but he was prepared to change his mind in the early 1950s. And India ultimately created more than a dozen linguistic states. It also created large-scale caste reservations, affirmative action programs, if you like, for lower castes to meet those groups' demands. Now, these different programs, the linguistic states, the reservations for groups, created what political scientists like to call cross-cutting cleavages, which means that within the majority Hindu population and the 11% in 1951 Muslim population and the Sikh and the Christian and other minorities, each of these was cross-cut by caste or cross-cut by the states and the languages that they were in or that they spoke. And in politics, cross-cutting cleavages are a good thing if you're talking about diffusing conflict, because it reduces the chance of there being permanent majorities and permanent minorities. And that was very important, I think, in explaining the success of India's democracy in the succeeding decades. There was no permanent in-group and permanent out-group in politics. And then another factor I identify is that India, unlike Pakistan, took early and decisive steps to control its military, which I cover in depth in a book I did in 2015 called Army and Nation. So the secular, plural, democratic system that was shaped in this process in the 1940s and 1950s was really remarkably stable and successful over the decades, despite the 1975 to 77 emergency rule of Congress under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. That didn't necessarily mean that Indians were happy with government performance always, with the government's level of efficiency, the country's level of growth, levels of corruption. They also became increasingly less happy with Congress and its leadership over time. But nonetheless, in opinion polls, every opinion poll I've ever seen shows an enormous degree of popular approval of democracy and happiness with democracy, as well as certain key institutions that were created in the 40s and 50s to sustain India's democracy, even if they might be unhappy with a particular party or leader in power. So the Congress Party has, over the past 35 or 40 years, increasingly lost ground in India to two kinds of parties. Firstly, regional and caste-based parties, and secondly, the Hindu nationalist BJP, which was founded in 1980 on the bones, if you like, of a previous Hindu nationalist party. For most of this period, though, the fact that Congress has been gradually losing electoral support and losing its role in parliament didn't radically change the basic shape of Indian democratic institutions that were established in the post-independence years. And the reason for this, I think, is that from 1989 to 2014, India was in what people have termed an era of coalitions in which no single party could form power on its own. There were a dozen or more parties in coalitions, and that prevented radical change because the governments didn't have a large enough majority or a two-thirds majority in the upper house in order to bring about large-scale political change or constitutional change. They were always constrained by their partners. This has changed significantly now with the end of the era of coalitions in 2014, when for the first time in recent memory, one party, the BJP, under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, won a majority of seats all on its own, 282 seats out of 545, even though it only received 31% of the vote in that election. And then the BJP in its second term won in its second election under Modi, won an even bigger majority in 2019 with 303 seats and 37% of the vote. And Congress really collapsed significantly in that election, winning fewer than 10% of the overall number of seats and couldn't even be designated as the official opposition, given that performance. Now, I think many liberal observers in India very much feared what was going to happen in Mr. Modi's first term. But I think with certain important exceptions, for instance, the university segment, the HRD ministry, the level of official government changes were fewer than some of those observers feared in the first term. And there were more focus on development governance kind of issues in the first term. He won election in 2014. In the manifesto, they only mentioned the word Hindu once in the entire manifesto. The word development was mentioned 84 times. There were lots of mentions of the word governance. He really ran on an agenda of economic reform, development, governance, rather than Hindu nationalism. I guess you could argue, some people might argue that was because Hindu nationalist credentials were already well known and therefore it didn't need to be overtly mentioned. But in the first term, there wasn't the wide-scale effort at Hindu nationalist transformation on the part of the government that some people were expecting. I think that reflects the fact that most Indian voters, like voters elsewhere in the 2014 election, were motivated by economic issues like jobs and inflation. But after winning an increased electoral victory in 2019, the BJP under Mr. Modi has pursued a much stronger and more radical policy of centralization and transforming India into a more majoritarian state. So Indian and international observers have sounded alarm bells about Indian democracy in a number of areas, some of which Bartley mentioned in her introduction, like press freedom, but also academic freedom, the autonomy of the university segment, restrictions on NGOs and civil society, the independence of the Electoral Commission. Probably right at the top, though, would be a couple of other things. Firstly, the rights and freedoms of religious minorities. And people highlight the citizenship laws that are targeted, seem to be targeted at Muslims, an increase in religious violence and discrimination against minorities, some of it state-sanctioned, but also some of it to do with states' perceived unwillingness to rein in those who are carrying out discrimination or violence against minorities. And then secondly, use of state power to punish political opponents and the media, for example, by tax raids, the use of foreign currency restrictions, or punitive prosecutions in which, as they say, the process is the punishment that have been directed against political opponents of the regime. So as a result, in the past 2-3 years, there are a large number of international ranking organizations that have downgraded India in terms of its democratic performance, somewhat to the annoyance of the government. So Freedom House, as Bartley said, in 2021 downgraded India from free to partly free. The large ranking organization in Sweden, VDEM, now classifies India as an electoral autocracy. So one question before I pass over to Siddharth that I wanted to address is, are these recent trends reversible? I think the answer there is electorally they are reversible, but politically and societally, some of these changes are going to be much harder to reverse. So let's remember that India has a very resilient political system. It is a large, diverse country with many poles of power. It bounced back before from a serious reversal in the 1970s under Indira Gandhi's emergency, which in some ways curtailed democracy even more. The BJP has lost in the past few years a number of important state elections, most recently in West Bengal, which lessens its chances of being in a position in the upper house in order to change the constitution. So even though I think it's quite likely that the BJP will win the next election, electoral competition is quite alive and maybe not well, but it's still going on in India. In West Bengal, the opposition won against expectations, despite a very strong BJP effort to win in that state. But some of the other changes, I think, over the past few years are going to be harder to undo. So the French political scientist Christophe Jaffalot has defined India now as an ethnic democracy. It's moving towards an ethnic democracy, which was a term that the Israeli political scientist Sami Smuha first used to describe Israel. And by that, he means a state where there's a clear sense that there is an ethnic majority that has the state, and that there is a threatening ethnic minority within the state or outside the state, and various measures have to be taken in order to safeguard that. And I think that sense is increasing in India. Even the opposition parties, although they may be competing successfully against the BJP, have had to change their tune, or feel that they have to change their tune in terms of an overt offense of secularism. And so even if the BJP may lose an election to them, its message with regard to majoritarianism is increasingly being adopted by some of the parties that it competes with. Things like the autonomy of the university system, or the independence of the media, or the societal suspicion and decline in relations amongst majority groups and minorities, in the sense that they are majorities and minorities. I think those kind of things are going to be a lot harder to change, even if the BJP itself loses electorally. I haven't been to India since the beginning of COVID, and so I'm going to pass you on now to Siddharth, who is experiencing all the changes firsthand for a more up-to-date view on what's going on, especially what's gone on since 2019. Siddharth.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I will literally pick up the baton from where you've handed it to me. I think your summary and your description of the trajectory that Indian democracy has taken from 47 to the present time is absolutely spot on. And I will not repeat many of your descriptions of the way India has been from 2014 onwards. And I will literally try to focus on what I have seen on the ground over the last couple of years, and through that answer the question that we are trying to grapple with today, which is India's democracy at risk? So democracies enter risky territory when we forget that democracy is not a one-shot event, but a continuous process, and a continuous process that requires an empowered and an informed citizenry who not only vote once every 5 years, but exercise some degree of oversight and control for the period between elections, so that those who do get elected do not and the second countervailing, I mean, apart from citizens being vigilant, the way in which most constitutional democracies structure themselves, you have a whole range of institutions that are meant to provide that kind of oversight, that kind of, shall we say, ensuring that the executive stays on the straight and narrow. And the primary institution, if I were to single out two institutions that play an absolutely crucial role in any constitutional democracy, the first is an independent judiciary, because you need judges at every level, not just at the highest level. You need judges at every level who are independent of the executive, and beyond being independent, are bold and defend the rights of citizens when those rights come under fire as a result of government policy. So you need an independent and courageous judiciary. That's one major institution. And the second is you need an independent and courageous media, because unless the media is able to shine a light on what's happening in a country and provide information on a continuous basis to people, people are not going to learn about the full consequences of what government policies are. They may not even know the full extent of what those policies are, forget about what they mean. And the story of India's democracy entering risky terrain, I'm afraid, is the story of this independent and courageous media and this independent and courageous judiciary somewhere down the line not living up to their mandate. And I will quickly talk through some highlights of this pretty sorry story. The media is very divided in India right now. You have a large section which is pro-establishment and militantly so, and has adopted the official political agenda of the ruling party and is an expert at firefighting whenever the ruling party enters a crisis. So you can have this section of the national media picking up and running away with stories that whose aim is to divert attention and to ensure that the real issues aren't discussed. And that section of the media which is independent of government and does not toe the line is subjected to a variety of legal and extra-legal pressures. These pressures can take the form of income tax raids, inquiries of one kind or the other. And in the last month and a half or two, several media houses, Dainik Bhaskar, which is the largest Hindi newspaper group, that had done some pretty good reporting during the second phase of COVID. They have been raided. NewsClick and News Laundry, two independent websites, have been raided, and lots of other media platforms and media organizations find that their access to finances is getting constrained. Government picks and chooses who it decides to advertise with, so critical media gets cut off, and of course, government advertising is an important source of revenue for many media houses. So there's financial pressure. There is, as I said, these raids that are launched on very flimsy pretexts. You have a whole bunch of criminal cases that state governments have begun to file, particularly the Uttar Pradesh government. The Wire itself is dealing with 5 criminal cases, and other media platforms have other cases too. And these are cases that are not the usual sort of cases that we've dealt with in the past. In other words, in the past we had our fair share of defamation cases, but these are criminal cases in the sense that in response to a story that the police or the state government doesn't like, you have the police filing criminal charges. So in one story, for example, the charges laid are that we have conspired to incite communal tension, or that we have conspired to spread rumors with a view to triggering an insurrection against the government. All kinds of absurd charges, which we will fight and we will win when we get our day in court. But these things can drag on, and they're an important form of harassment. In Kashmir, journalists have been arrested. Journalists are regularly summoned to police stations. So there's a whole bunch of sort of pressure tactics that the government is employing to lean on the media, and as a result of which the dominant section of the media is simply not doing its job. And when you then turn and look at the judiciary, which is the second major institution, I'll just mention 2 or 3 cases. The government introduced about 3 years ago a system of anonymous electoral bonds. This is a very interesting way that the BJP devised to have its favored business houses donate large sums of money to it without the public ever finding out. And lots of petitions have been filed in the Supreme Court challenging the wisdom and constitutionality of anonymous electoral bonds. And the Election Commission itself 3 years ago had submitted to the Supreme Court and to the government that anonymous electoral bonds is a very bad idea. It's not a good form of electoral campaign finance. And the Supreme Court has not bothered to prioritize these petitions. Election after election has been held where large sums of unaccounted money are raised by the BJP. Yet the Supreme Court simply cannot find the time to take a decision on such a crucial issue that's central to the integrity of Indian elections. That's issue number 1. Issue number 2, Steve mentioned the targeting of Muslims in India, and one of the significant legal ways in which this government has done that is by the Citizenship Amendment Act, which for the first time in India makes religion a criterion for granting citizenship, and in particular, if you're not a Muslim. So in other words, if your religion is anything but Islam, then as a refugee from Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Afghanistan, you can be fast-tracked for citizenship, and this has never happened before. And even though the government insists that this change applies only to non-Indians who want to become Indians, but it's not clear how any rule to make an Indian, to make somebody a citizen of India, can survive the test of constitutionality if it is based on cherry-picking religious affiliations. It just doesn't make sense. This too has been challenged in the Supreme Court, but it's been 2 years now. The court hasn't found the time to take a view. And the third issue, the undemocratic and unilateral manner in which Jammu and Kashmir's constitutional status was downgraded, and its position as a state in the union was taken away. And of course, that decision of the Modi government was accompanied by wide-scale arrests of politicians, of civil society activists, and so on. Many of them moved habeas corpus petitions at courts at different levels, none of which reached any fruition. And the apex, it's a matter of great regret that the Supreme Court has not again found the time to take a view on the constitutionality of the Modi government's decisions on Kashmir. So these are three examples of significant policy decisions that the government took, which were challenged on the grounds that they violate the letter and spirit of the Constitution. And the Supreme Court, I wouldn't mind if they held hearings and decided one way or the other, even if they decided in favor of the government. But they simply refused to take a view on this. And to my mind, this is an example of the abdication of responsibility. A more recent case, Bartley mentioned Pegasus, the Pegasus project. A number of politicians, journalists, human rights defenders, lawyers, even members of the Supreme Court registry their numbers are on this list of probable targets of Pegasus. And multiple petitions have been filed in the Supreme Court asking simply for an independent investigation into this. And it's been a little over a month since the Chief Justice said he would pronounce an interim order and set up some kind of committee. And there's been no word since then. So there's lots of, maybe there's some procedural issues holding that up, and a judgment will come in the case of Pegasus. I'm hopeful of that. But when it comes to Kashmir, when it comes to the Citizenship Amendment Act, when it comes to electoral bonds, all we have is silence from the Supreme Court. And this is really, this undermines the fine traditions of the Indian judiciary and actually jeopardizes Indian democracy. The last point I wanted to make before I hand over to Manjari is that the Election Commission, which is meant to guarantee free and fair elections in India, one of its members, Ashok Lavasa, was also on the list of targets for Pegasus. That's what our investigation uncovered. And unsurprisingly, Mr. Lavasa was he was the only election commissioner who took an adverse view of Narendra Modi's style of campaigning in the 2019 election, where Mr. Modi made several controversial remarks. I have no hesitation in saying they were communal, anti-Muslim remarks, and complaints were filed before the Election Commission. The Election Commission sat on those complaints for weeks. And finally, when it became impossible to delay pronouncing judgment, the Election Commission ruled that Mr. Modi had not violated the election law. And of course, Lavasa dissented. So it's not surprising that Lavasa's number then ends up on the Pegasus list. And of course, since then, Lavasa has left the Election Commission, and you have other, somebody who's taken his place. And with his departure, the Election Commission has changed its view on the desirability of electoral bonds. So we can see how the Election Commission too, its independence has come under a cloud. And if you look at the fact that these are institutions that are meant to guarantee the formal functioning of India as an electoral democracy, and I'm not even going into wider issues of the targeting of minorities or the way in which laws are passed, the failure to have discussions in parliament and so on. It's really the way in which things have happened have created a pretty dangerous situation for India, and one has one is not in the least surprised when international publications or think tanks which study these things have consistently downgraded India's performance on the democracy front or the media freedom front. So I will end there with this rather dark and gloomy prediction and hand over to Manjari.
Okay, thank you, Siddharth. I'm delighted to be here on this panel. And what Steve and Siddharth have done really, really well is essentially lay out the state of affairs in domestic politics. So, what are the institutions that matter, and which institutions have seen backsliding, which institutions are still holding firm. And so, of course, as Siddharth pointed out, he did end on a very gloomy and depressing note. Which you can see from like his years on the ground, particularly with The Wire's work, which I read regularly, by the way, and has done an amazing job of journalism in India. So what I'm going to do is something a little bit different, right? So I am actually going to lay out the state of play in foreign policy. The question is, why does all of this matter for India's foreign policy? We know why it matters domestically, but why is it that we can't simply shrug our shoulders, or rather India can't shrug its shoulders and say, okay, so we are going towards authoritarianism. It seems to be serving China well, so why not us, right? So essentially, I want to kind of lay out, what India's identity was at that time of independence and how it was tied up with democracy. Then I want to talk about why these ideals were essentially a source of strength for India on the world stage, and also talk about how India has or has not utilized democracy in its foreign policy, right? So what I think it's really, really important to understand that essentially when India cut its teeth after independence as a leader on the world stage of developing countries, it was an influential country, not simply because it was an anti-colonial country, but because it was also democratic, right? So democracy was intrinsic to its national identity as a leader of developing states. And particularly secular democratic ideals were not just enshrined in its constitution, but secularism was a source of how India displayed its influence on the world stage as home to this, to this diverse democracy with different ethnicities and languages. Now, why do I say they were a source of strength? They were a source of strength because essentially in different foreign policy decision-making that India chose to do during the Cold War and the post-Cold War, what we found was that India's democratic reputation helped it in many, many ways, right? So India, for example, during the Cold War, eventually leaned towards the Soviet Union. Now, the reason it could do this and yet not be condemned as an authoritarian stooge was because India was a democracy, because it had free and fair elections, because it was an undisputed leader and champion of democratic ideals, right? It also allowed India to call out the United States for imperialist behavior. So India has often, during the Cold War, post-Cold War, has often called out the United States for what it has termed imperialistic behavior. And India's democratic reputation has given India a shield in terms of how and when to choose to call out the United States. And this very reputation also essentially allowed India for many, many years to dance on the edge of what was, not a good relationship with the United States, right? So it was a pretty hostile relationship at certain parts. Now this goes back to what academics like to call democratic peace theory, right? So I'm sorry to inject theory into this, but I love international relations theory, so I'm going to bring it in. But democratic peace theory essentially states that in the history of the world, two democracies have never gone to war with each other. This doesn't mean that democracies are not aggressive. It means that democracies do not go to war with each other for various reasons. But we can kind of see democratic peace hold in terms of India and the United States, that even when you had the relationship at its lowest point, right, there was never an issue of open conflict. It never happened, even when India leans towards the Soviet Union, even when India shuns the United States, shuns offers of help. Finally, I think the way democracy really helped India was, in the 1990s and in the 2000s, when we started talking about India rising, it essentially allowed India to rise without this fear on the part of the United States or the West that India was going to be a belligerent country, right? So to compare and contrast it, you can see the reaction to the rise of China, which is an authoritarian state. So in that sense, the United States starts talking about counterbalancing China with India in the 1990s. And the reason for this is really the difference in ideals, because in many ways, India actually flouted the rules and norms of international order in a way China hasn't. So for example, China has signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. China has signed the NPT. India has signed neither of those things. So India was able to reject certain norms of international order because it had these democratic ideals and because it was a democratic state. And so the United States and countries in the West accepted India on that basis, right? So India was, in short, a country that they could understand and did not fear. Now, interestingly, even though India, had democracy as a huge source of strength, India was also very pragmatic about how it utilized this democracy. So what do I mean by this? So essentially, India has never engaged, well, almost never engaged in democracy promotion in its foreign policy in any way, right? So why is this? So in India's foreign policy, the most important thing was non-interference in its sovereignty. And this goes back to India's colonial experience, its experience of, imperialism, colonialism for 200 years. And so democratic ideals and intervention on the basis of democratic ideals, particularly during the Cold War, was essentially seen as a cloak for neo-imperialism. And we shouldn't forget that India, endured 200 years of quite racist and exploitative colonial rule by a country that was actually moving towards democratic principles at home, right? Particularly from the 19th century onwards. And of course, when India, had its anti-colonial nationalist movement, it received quite a cool reception from the United States, which was siding with the United Kingdom rather than India and the Indian independence movement. And so even post-1947, India never perceived the United States as sympathetic to its colonial experience, the way it perceived the Soviet Union, which came out in its constitution, denounced imperialism. So India has never engaged in democracy promotion in its foreign policy. And so this had a number of benefits. So the first thing was it actually allowed India to be extremely pragmatic in its dealing with other countries. So if we look at India's relationship with the Middle Eastern countries, India relies on the Middle East for energy, and it has millions of workers in the Middle East. India has never made any statements about authoritarian governments or particularly authoritarian monarchies in the Middle East. It also allowed India, as I said before, to cozy up to the Soviet Union. India also is, interestingly, even when India did have democracy promotion ideals as part of its foreign policy behavior, it often backtracked on them, right? So if we look at the 1971 Bangladesh War, which was essentially India's humanitarian intervention against the genocide that was happening by the Pakistani army against Bengalis, India backtracks in the United Nations and claims security and intervention and sovereignty to protect itself rather than humanitarian intervention, right? Now, as a consequence of all of this, what it meant was that when India did actually take a stand on democracy and human rights, because it very rarely did so, it carried a lot of weight. So one of the ways it did this was through its relationship with South Africa, or rather the lack of relationship with South Africa. So from 1947 onwards, India raised the issue of apartheid in South Africa almost every year in the United Nations. And in 1954, India broke all diplomatic and trade contacts with the South African government. It actually became the first country to impose political and economic sanctions that continued until 1992 and were only really fully lifted after apartheid was abolished in South Africa. And so this worked in a number of significant ways. So for example, because of India's stance against South Africa, South Africa was unable to join the Commonwealth, right? So it mobilized other countries, leading South Africa to withdraw its membership and was subsequently expelled. So my reason for giving all these examples is that democracy is not something that's just intrinsically important in terms of India's domestic politics and in terms of how it preserves communal harmony in terms of its population, but because it's been very, very intrinsic to India's foreign policy identity. And it has worked for India over and over again in very pragmatic ways and in very concrete ways in foreign policy behavior. Now, where I would say is I would take a kind of a balancing stance between Steve and Siddharth here, is that I would say that identity is very radically hard to transform. Like we've seen over and over again, that when you have ideas that are embedded in institutions, they become they become very, very difficult to shift because ideas tend to be sticky and they tend to be institutionalized. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that they don't shift at all. Right. So, and as Siddharth has detailed, as you can see, what he has done is he's detailed some of the chipping away the institutions that enshrine some of these ideas that have been very, very key to India's democratic identity. So essentially, if there is democratic backsliding and how fast this pace is, will result in a price. And that price isn't just domestic, but what we're going to see that we're going to see India pay that price, even in its foreign policy and even in its relations with the rest of the world. And I'll just stop here.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Super. Thank you all three. That was fantastic. And I have several questions. And I know that Manjari, you have the most time limit of anybody. So I'm going to start with a foreign policy question. I have a question saying, do you think that the global political community will continue its business as usual foreign policy, given the direction that it appears to be going in India today? How do you see going forward? Manjari?
Yeah, Bartley, you froze for a minute. So I'm just going to repeat the question. You asked me whether the global policy community will continue in its dealings with India, given what?
Business as usual, given the direction that it appears to be going. Like if you, as you were saying, if they continue to chip away at institutions, how do you see that playing out?
So I think that's actually a really complex question, right? So it kind of depends on how the balance of power play out. On one hand, if you have President Biden talk about an alliance of democracies, essentially what you're presuming is that everybody in that alliance is democratic and is fully committed to democratic ideals, right? So does that then allow other countries to call out India if it sees this democratic backsliding? And what happens if they do? So if the United States calls out India for democratic backsliding, I assure you it's not going to go well. Right, and it will definitely damage the India-U.S. partnership. So I think I think what you see is a very careful position right now taken by the United States, particularly where the Biden administration has not made any public criticisms of the Modi government, even though I have heard that privately it's been a different story. And so. So if going forward these balances of power are based on democratic versus non-democratic ideology, I think you're going to see a lot of gray areas where there's going to be this assessment of, well, how do we deal with India, and to what extent will, assuming the Modi government stays in power, to what extent will they accept criticism of our policies, and to what extent will they then commit to partnerships with us?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a tough one. It's hard to have a crystal ball, especially given recent election lost in West Bengal. I was looking at that. Can you hear me? I have this fear that my internet is breaking up. And how reassured should we be that if India's people change their mind about Modi at the next election, or perhaps the ones after that, that the institutions would enable them to push him out in a free and fair vote? Who wants to take that? Stephen, Siddharth? Siddharth, you need to unmute.
Yes, I can take that. No, I think, the fact is that BJP lost the elections in Bengal, and you have important state elections coming up in Uttar Pradesh and Gujarat next year. And to my, sort of rough and ready, my assessment is that all of these elections are actually pretty, that they are open. I wouldn't say they're wide open, but they are open. I mean, there is a contest on the cards, and there is a lot of public dissatisfaction with Mr. Modi's governance or lack thereof, and the opposition is showing some signs of getting its act together. But I remain concerned about the the role that electoral bonds play. In other words, election financing. I remain concerned about the independence of the Election Commission, and it's because it can skew the rules this way and that way in order to help, and it's shown itself willing to have done that in the past. And I'm a little bit concerned about October surprise kind of events that the government may also think of between now and the next election. So, but if I remain hopeful that a free and fair election will take place, and people will vote their conscience at that time.
Thank you. I have a question from the chat for Professor Wilkinson. How would you compare the efforts to move away from established democratic standards to the efforts in the United States that a certain party is taking to curtail voting rights and with gerrymandering? Is it something you can compare?
Let's see. So with regard to gerrymandering, I think the situation is better in India than it is in the US, because one thing the Election Commission does is decide what the boundaries are. And although there has been a little criticism from time to time of the specific boundaries, I think by and large they're much fairer electoral units in terms of the geographic construction of constituencies than you see in the US, where different partisan governments have a clear incentive to tip things one way or the other. Whether it's Maryland on the Democratic side or whether in Texas it's done on the Republican side. So in that regard, I think India's in a better situation. India's elections are also electronic without the controversies that we see in the US over the electronic voting. There have been occasional criticisms of the integrity of the electronic voting machines, the EVMs, and the BJP actually made criticisms when it lost several times that maybe this isn't fair. But by and large, there's a recognition that the basic integrity of the count is better and stronger in India than it has been in some US elections.
Okay. Mandre, I'm going to come back to you because we've got the time issue. You write that you spoke to a high-ranking individual who told you that Modi's goal is to make India a rich country, but not a powerful one. And that doesn't square with the poverty in India today, does it? Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I remember that interview. I used that in my book. I was talking about that with respect to essentially India's narratives about becoming a great power. And where that came from was essentially that the BJP realizes that electoral success really relies on domestic economics and not on foreign policy. So, whether India projects power abroad or not, foreign policy issues don't matter as much to the common voter as do, the price of onions on the streets, which are really, really important. And elections have been won and lost on that. So the point that he was making to me was that the BJP government was acutely conscious of the fact that what was really important for India at this point was GDP growth, because the BJP's electoral fortunes were tied to that rather than to foreign policy and notions of great power.
Okay, thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't ask Siddharth or all of you, with the breakthrough this weekend, the Facebook news of everything that's going on with Facebook and WhatsApp. When I wrote the numbers down, it's extraordinary. They have 340 million users, according to the Washington Post. The New York Times says 410 million users. I mean, we don't even have that many people in the United States. And so Facebook only has something like 16% of its budget to combat misinformation in places outside North America. How do you see this playing out? Siddharth, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mess. I mean, Facebook, and if you add to that WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, it's a huge, huge tool for communication, but also for disinformation, unfortunately. And we know that political parties and political activists are very adept at gaming social media, and they've been doing that in a very organized way. And what these disclosures have shone a light on is that Facebook, even when confronted with evidence of its platform being misused by elements close to the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, they have refused to take action. So even with the constraint of 16% of its budget being devoted to fact-checking or monitoring hate speech outside of the US, they had enough information to take action, and they didn't. And the reason the whistleblower even came out is because of mounting evidence that Facebook willingly turned a blind eye. And we've seen now 3 or 4 instances of this, and I think this is something that Facebook urgently needs to address.
Could I say something? So I wrote a book. I think the effects of social media in damaging intergroup relations are just very severe. I wrote not just in India, elsewhere in the world. I wrote a book in the early 2000s looking at communal violence in India, and at that stage, many people spread negative messages in local constituencies, local towns, using video, word of mouth, telephone, press, these kinds of things. But now you can spread things instantly from one part of the country to the other. You can doctor them, you can change them. The potential for magnifying instances and spreading this kind of communal division is just much, much greater, I think, than it was when I was working on this 20 years ago.
Thank you. Yeah. There's a question that's come in about the increasing blurring of lines between religious identity and politics. And the question is, where do you see this combination and meshing of religion and state leading? Does anyone want to take that?
I can try. I mean, I think that, religion has always been used by politicians and politicians going back the past 70 years. But there is no denying the fact that its salience today is much greater. And the BJP makes no bones about the fact that it is a Hindu party and speaks primarily for the Hindus. And you can see this in the rhetoric of its leaders repeatedly. You can see this in the horrible statements and speeches that elected, the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, for example, regularly makes. And, this is unfortunately something which, as Steve said, other parties are unwilling to call them out for. And so we've seen in the response of the Congress and the Aam Aadmi Party an attempt to also sound Hindu, but in a more constructive manner. So I'm afraid for the foreseeable future, religion is going to be, continue to be married with politics to the detriment of Indian democracy.
Can I add something to that, Bartley? So I agree with Siddharth that religion and politics have always been intertwined in India, but it's a little bit different now. One of the things that I'm finding in my research and in my work is also that there is how should I put it? There's almost like a performance that is happening among government officers, right? So it used to be that, particularly with the Foreign Service or with the Indian Administrative Service, these were secular offices and secular officers and secular institutions, where really the focus was on being Western educated and elite. And so now it's not that has changed so much as that there is more of a pressure to perform Hindu nationalism. for the Modi administration's benefit. So that's not so much an intertwining of religion and politics, but rather where religion, or at least lip service to particular notions of religion have now become necessary for advancement, or even staying on and performing well in the service. And that's a difference. That's not something that existed before. So that's how you can see one qualitative change in how religion is playing out in government institutions.
Thank you. There's one incredibly broad question that would be a nice way to say goodbye to you, because I know you have someone says, what about China and India's role in the region? And is this one we can refer everyone to the last chapter?
So, Bartley,
first of all, the difference.
Sorry.
Right?
Bartley, first of all, thank you for your kind words about the book. It just came out. So yes, I'm very excited about it. So what about China and India's role in the region? I'll just say this one thing, which I think is really important. So when I started studying China and India, which was, decades ago, I won't go into now how many decades ago, but many years ago, people would ask me why on earth I would study the two together, right? Why would you study China and India, and what on earth do they have in common? And then about, I would say 10 years ago, if you wanted to understand South Asia, you could do so without studying China, right? 5 years ago, that was still the same. Today, if somebody wants to study South Asia, right, and they come to me and they don't have an understanding of China, I will tell them that you cannot study South Asian foreign policy or the balance of power without studying China's interests in the region. So what about China and India in the region? Well, China is very much present in the region. China's interests today are very much enmeshed in the region. And it is almost impossible to study South Asia today without getting a good understanding of China's interests in the region, how it's enmeshed, and how India is responding to that. Bartley, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I was muted. Sorry. I want to say thank you very much. And if you need to leave because you have another meeting, we are respectful of that, and we'll say thank you very much for having joined us today.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I've got a very open question for our last question, unless somebody else sends another one. Do each of you, Stephen and Siddharth, have a question you would like to ask each other? Someone wrote. Is there something that you've got, Stephen? What would you like to ask him, or vice versa?
I think I would like to ask Siddharth. I mean, given that he's at the center of the media, what's the role for the independent media going forward, do you think, in India? Your publication, a few other publications have managed to survive in the current environment, have a wide readership. What do you see as the future? If there's a change in regime, do you think the changes we've seen in the media over the past few years are going to change with the regime, or there are certain aspects that are just going to stay the same?
No, that's a great question, and I think there's two aspects to digital media and the work that we do. One, of course, is the technology, right, and the medium itself, and the second is the content. And I would say that the shift from traditional media, in other words, television and print, to digital, which began quite late in India, is today, that transition is well underway, and all of our newspapers have a much larger digital readership, which is growing than their print publications. So, the fact is that they will continue to survive, but given their cost structures, either they find new ways of revenue generation for the all digital world, or things will become very difficult for them. But as far as we are concerned, I think the fact that the kind of journalism we put out finds if it strikes a chord with the public at large, all of us are trying now to convince readers and viewers that they should be paying for our journalism, and we are managing to keep our head above the water, and I hope my other media organizations that are digital are also doing the same. But the government is not making things easier. They have now come up with a new set of rules in an attempt to regulate digital media, which is going to make our functioning much more difficult. We've challenged those rules in the High Court, and I hope eventually that the court will strike these rules down as being unconstitutional. But it's clear that the government is not done yet, and that they regard digital media as the enemy. They have recognized in their internal reports their inability to control the discourse on the digital side, whereas they're quite successful with newspapers and TV channels. So we have a battle on our hands, but I think it's a battle which we are quite well placed right now to fight. So I'm not unduly worried by what the government has in store for us. And my question for Stephen would be, just your sense of how the Biden administration going forward is going to respond to, I mean, if our thesis is correct, that India's democracy is at risk and will continue to, endanger itself. Is it your sense that this may become an issue that for the Biden administration, or will the geopolitical realities, the need to use India against China, et cetera, override any of those kinds of concerns?
Yeah, so I think that the concern about China trumps concerns about India's domestic degree of freedom or democracy or minority rights at the moment. Push comes to shove. Even if
Biden, you said Trump. I think you mean Biden. I
think you're muted, Stephen.
Sorry, I think the concern with China just looms really large at the moment and takes precedence over concerns with what's going on in India with regard to democratic backsliding, perceived democratic backsliding. I think the one region where this probably doesn't apply is the Gulf, where you've seen more criticism by the Muslim majority states there of what's going on in India. I think so I'm not an expert in foreign policy, but my perception is that the Biden administration is talking about liberalism in foreign policy, but is motivated very much by realist concerns.
Right.
Super, thank you so much. I think that's a good note for us to end on, to be respectful of everyone's time. And these Zooms can't go on forever, as much as I would love to continue the conversation. And so on that note, I would like to tell you that we tried, we won't do this, it's too difficult. We got as far as Istanbul tonight, but we got not quite to Munich. So you have a standing invitation for 2022 to come to Munich, and we will try to put together a part 2. And I will work with you and your schedules, I promise. And I'm saying this to our community. We'll try to do a continuation of this next year and have an in-person or hybrid event at least. Before we go, I want to thank you both very much for joining us. And I would also like to thank the team at Amerikahaus. They're open again, and I would like to encourage our community. You all watch their calendar of events on their website and visit their cool exhibits. They've got a fantastic photography exhibit right now. And say that I look forward to seeing you again in person at our next event, which looks like now it's going to be December 3rd with the journalist and author, George Packer. So if you watch our website, dialoguesondemocracy.com, we've got information on upcoming events. We said, on YouTube. We also have current articles and books that we're reading. So I have Manjari's book up right now. I will post this week a link to how people can support The Wire or connect there, and a link to Stephen, your website at Yale. If you like what we're doing, I hope you'll consider supporting our work as well. I look forward to seeing you again next time. I thank our guests immensely for tonight, and wherever you're watching from, I'd like to thank you all for engaging. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Good evening.